The logistics framework supporting the Russian Federation's maritime oil exports has entered a phase of systemic degradation across multiple axes, simultaneously impacting the Baltic Sea and Black Sea terminals. The strategic network, anchored on the Primorsk and Ust-Luga installations in the northwest and extended through the Novorossiysk complex in the south, functions as a dual-core artery for hydrocarbon outflow toward European and Mediterranean markets. Each installation processes and dispatches refined petroleum products and crude oil through maritime infrastructure connected to inland pipeline systems, rail corridors, and storage reservoirs. The synchronized impairment of this corridor reveals not isolated sabotage but rather a coordinated sequence of strikes, which now disrupts both geographies and timing of Russian outbound logistical flows. Operational capacity at the Primorsk terminal has been compromised following structural damage to mooring systems and an adjacent pumping station. In Ust-Luga, a fire sustained from an earlier explosion triggered emergency containment measures within the distillation and storage zones, limiting throughput. Southward, in the Novorossiysk hub, repeated drone incursions and secondary detonations have disabled at least one offshore mooring point, restricting anchorage access and halting outbound movement. Vessels in both maritime zones remain at sea under provisional maritime protocols. Their immobilization reflects not only tactical delays but a wider paralysis extending from disrupted loading cycles to contractual suspensions. Logistics across multiple axes, rail delivery, port management, tanker allocation, now exhibit systemic collapse dynamics. No official rerouting of volumes has been initiated toward Arctic or Far Eastern terminals, indicating the absence of reserve routing strategies. The current phase registers the first instance of simultaneous north-south export corridor disruption since the full escalation of hostilities, reducing active export bandwidth by an estimated majority share. The operational mechanics leading to the current paralysis of Russian maritime oil terminals demonstrate a sustained pattern of strategic intelligence exploitation and remote attack sequencing. Prior to the disruption of Primorsk and Ust-Luga, reconnaissance assets mapped thermal signatures of pumping infrastructure, surveillance of berth activity, and vessel rotation intervals. Signal intercepts and satellite imaging confirmed load densities, storage tank occupation rates, and the timing of convoy arrivals. South of the operational line, similar analysis at Novorossiysk tracked electromagnetic emissions linked to radar and vessel communication systems, enabling pattern projection for logistics windows. The subsequent deployment of loitering munitions and unmanned aerial systems across both vectors reflected pre-targeting based on route predictability and structural vulnerability. Payload optimization suggests a mixture of high-temperature incendiaries and shaped charge warheads configured to inflict localized structural failures without wide-area kinetic contamination, indicating a doctrine of sustained disruption rather than annihilation. Logistics planners within the adversarial structure demonstrated capability to integrate attack vectors into periods of high-volume transfer, maximizing interruption yield. The combination of asymmetric reconnaissance with modular strike elements permitted sequencing that overwhelmed point defense systems and emergency suppression protocols. Reinforced by deliberate timing asymmetry between the northern and southern attacks, the dual theater implementation served to destabilize response coordination across maritime defense zones. No evidence of radar suppression or jamming was detected, suggesting confidence in evasion and penetration capabilities through route low-altitude navigation and reduced acoustic footprint. Maritime notice-to-mariner systems failed to register pre-strike alerts, and internal safety mechanisms within loading bays were either bypassed or neutralized. Each strike thus reflects a culmination of premeditated engineering assessment, timing optimization, and pressure calibration. No detonation appears to have been initiated without verification of high-value process presence, reinforcing the strategic nature of the campaign. The strike sequence began with a series of coordinated detonations targeting the transfer and loading infrastructure of the Primorsk terminal, resulting in the immediate cessation of outbound flow operations. The first confirmed impact disrupted an active mooring arm connected to a fully loaded Aframax-class tanker, forcing the vessel to abort departure procedures and remain at sea under emergency anchoring protocol. Concurrently, a secondary explosion ignited the auxiliary pumping station positioned adjacent to Storage Cluster B, leading to structural buckling in two pressurized tank units and the rupture of pipeline segment R-17. Emergency suppression systems failed to contain the thermal escalation, producing a prolonged combustion zone that rendered adjacent control equipment inoperable. The resulting fuel dispersion contaminated berths and adjoining safety channels, triggering a full-scale shutdown across all loadout modules. At Ust-Luga, the attack exploited a logistical inflection point during a scheduled triple-shift transition. The detonation of a directed payload above the rail tanker unloading platform severed the interchange junction between inland delivery and maritime dispatch, leading to a cascade halt in all automated coordination systems. Simultaneously, an adjacent fire reached temperature thresholds exceeding standard containment tolerances, resulting in the controlled venting of vaporized petroleum products. The rail corridor feeding the terminal became impassable due to subsequent track warping and minor detonations attributed to fuel volatility exposure. Within 90 minutes of the initial strike, the site's dispatch functionality fell below operational thresholds, rendering its berth allocation matrix non-functional. In the southern axis, the Novorossiysk terminal sustained 3 confirmed penetrations. The primary impact zone was recorded at the offshore single-point mooring system, where a loitering munition detonated near the buoy pipeline junction. Damage assessment confirmed full detachment of the flowline segment feeding 2 long-range tankers, with visual confirmation of active hydrocarbon discharge into the anchorage zone. A follow-up strike neutralized the command module responsible for traffic control, disabling radar and visual guidance equipment used for inbound and outbound convoy management. The third strike breached the inland pumping compound, igniting residual compounds within filtration chambers. The resulting shockwave compromised 2 adjoining administrative structures and eliminated on-site redundancy systems. The impact extended beyond physical damage. Real-time communication channels between terminal operators, customs authorities, and maritime logistics coordinators experienced overload and failure, further compounding delays. Emergency redirection protocols could not be implemented, as alternate terminals lacked immediate throughput capacity and required reconfiguration. The immobilization of dozens of outbound vessels in both maritime regions created a layered backlog. Tankers queued offshore without clearance, inland storage facilities reached threshold capacity, and upstream pipeline networks required throttling to prevent overpressure. As of the third day post-strike, active export volume across all 3 nodes registered below 20% of nominal levels. Crucially, the cascading operational halt triggered automatic escalation clauses in shipping insurance contracts, leading to the suspension of coverage for all tankers in the affected zones. Reinsurance carriers initiated clause triggers that disqualified vessels from risk corridors, compelling fleet managers to abort planned shipments or reroute vessels toward neutral waters. This response paralyzed the so-called shadow fleet, the unofficial maritime structure sustaining sanctioned export flow, as unregistered or semi-flagged tankers now lacked both legal passage and financial indemnity. Without coverage, port calls and fuel purchases became non-viable, effectively trapping vessels across both corridors and halting circulation. By the end of the impact phase, the oil corridor ceased to function as an integrated system. From mooring structures and pumping stations to dispatch software and tanker navigation, all segments reflected cumulative damage or systemic lockdown. Maritime exit points became nodes of immobilization, while onshore logistics exhibited signs of saturation and mechanical failure. The corridor's ability to recover operational integrity without full reconstruction was assessed as limited. The scale and synchronicity of the attack suggest long-term intent to degrade strategic infrastructure rather than temporary disruption. Following the initial impact phase, a chain of secondary consequences began to unfold across both maritime theaters, deepening the paralysis of Russia's petroleum export infrastructure. The first layer of cascading effects emerged within the integrated terminal systems. Structural damage inflicted upon high-pressure conduits in Primorsk initiated a mechanical domino effect along interlinked flow control modules. Sensors failed under thermal stress, producing uncontrolled surges in residual pressure along feeder lines, some of which terminated in auxiliary reservoirs lacking reinforced containment. One such unit, positioned north of Sector D, experienced internal rupture, releasing vaporized hydrocarbons into the surrounding containment trench. Contact with residual flame from the primary detonation generated a localized deflagration, damaging emergency shutoff valves and eliminating the possibility of reactivating bypass lines. Similar overpressure incidents occurred in Ust-Luga, where the rupture of a lateral pipeline between the railway intake yard and processing units induced rapid backflow and partial collapse of pipeline support structures. These mechanical failures fragmented internal routing logic and separated clusters of operational subsystems, leading to the isolation of core modules and the collapse of centralized coordination. The second layer of secondary impact manifested in maritime security posture and traffic behavior. Immediately following the strike sequence, the anchorage zones at both Primorsk and Ust-Luga were reclassified by international shipping advisories as elevated risk zones, equivalent to conflict-adjacent waters. As a result, vessels awaiting clearance executed emergency relocation protocols, repositioning outside designated economic zones to avoid possible follow-on detonations. However, lack of immediate port availability in adjacent neutral zones forced several vessels to idle without access to resupply, freshwater, or insurance validation. Concurrently, within the Black Sea corridor, the strike on Novorossiysk's offshore mooring structure triggered oil discharge into navigable waters. This prompted the immediate dispatch of containment vessels, whose operations were subsequently delayed by thermal exposure to still smoldering infrastructure. The presence of hydrocarbon surface layers prompted regional maritime regulators to impose temporary exclusion zones, blocking all traffic within a radius of several nautical miles. Consequently, inbound supply vessels redirected to anchor points beyond visual range, creating a second echelon of immobile maritime assets and further expanding the backlog. The third-order effects extended into rail and pipeline infrastructure. In both northern and southern sectors, crude input volume had to be reduced to avoid structural overloads within storage and pumping facilities now operating at minimal throughput. This throttling propagated upstream along pipeline segments previously optimized for uninterrupted flow, inducing reverse pressure gradients in collector zones. As operational integrity degraded, valve maintenance crews were unable to access key junctures due to fire persistence, structural instability, or unexploded ordnance hazards. Pipeline regulators activated emergency venting to prevent rupture, releasing controlled volumes into containment pits now approaching overflow limits. In parallel, rail delivery systems encountered spatial gridlock. With unloading yards disabled, tank cars remained stationed across approach lines, immobilizing subsequent deliveries. A backlog exceeding design capacity was recorded at Ust-Luga's secondary rail terminal, where over 100 cars remained in stasis awaiting offload. Signal coordination and switching yards were suspended to prevent further congestion, rendering entire feeder segments inoperative. Beyond direct logistical nodes, the disruption also penetrated the informational and administrative command chain. Terminal coordination hubs typically rely on centralized data management for scheduling, safety compliance, customs documentation, and vessel turnaround tracking. These hubs suffered degradation in both hardware and software capacity due to localized EMP bursts, thermal loading, and line-of-sight equipment damage. Without synchronized data exchange, inter-terminal coordination ceased. Dispatching authorities failed to issue revised scheduling or routing advisories, causing a breakdown in chain-of-custody documentation and invalidating pre-authorized cargo transfer protocols. International clearinghouses subsequently withheld validation for customs processing on pending shipments, freezing payment releases and triggering cross-border arbitration in energy contracts. Multiple insurers declared force majeure clauses in coverage agreements, citing structural damage, undefined risk conditions, and lack of verifiable control zones. As a result, energy traders faced immediate loss of financial backing for scheduled transfers, resulting in the abrupt halt of transactions across both spot and forward contract markets. These compound effects extended the scope of disruption beyond the tactical degradation of physical infrastructure. Russia's primary energy export corridor evolved into a non-operational theater not through singular catastrophic destruction but via engineered systemic overload. Disruption extended across mechanical, logistical, maritime, and regulatory domains. Each layer, though partially survivable in isolation, collapsed when compounded. The architecture of continuity, based on redundancy, rerouting, and rapid response, was dismantled by deliberate saturation of critical points without the necessity of full-spectrum annihilation. The resulting configuration rendered recovery operations reactive, fragmented, and dependent on assets unavailable within the immediate logistics perimeter. The corridor, once engineered for high-volume uninterrupted throughput, now existed as a string of paralyzed nodes, inaccessible to coordination and devoid of forward function. As structural incapacitation and secondary chain reactions locked Russia's primary oil corridors into paralysis, the fifth phase of disruption initiated a compounding financial and navigational breakdown. This phase produced effects beyond infrastructure and logistics, extending into international markets, regulatory enforcement, and insurance ecosystems. The convergence of these factors catalyzed a systemic failure of Russia's maritime hydrocarbon export economy, as operators, traders, and insurers simultaneously disengaged, leaving the so-called shadow fleet functionally inoperative. In the Baltic sector, tankers stranded offshore entered into contractual violation cycles due to the inability to complete scheduled loading operations. Many vessels, already listed on high-risk registries due to dual-flag configurations or incomplete compliance with international maritime safety codes, became uninsurable. Leading reinsurance firms activated exclusion clauses and ceased recognition of Russian origin cargo under current exposure frameworks. With no coverage available, port authorities across adjacent neutral waters declared temporary moratoriums on admitting vessels departing from or scheduled for Russian ports. These restrictions extended even to indirect loading routes involving transshipment or offshore bunkering platforms. As a result, the mobile segment of the export apparatus, designed to bypass sanctions and surveillance, became geographically locked, functionally stranded, and administratively disqualified from operating in the broader maritime financial system. In the Black Sea corridor, the immobilization of assets reached critical thresholds. The Novorossiysk anchorage zone, surrounded by expanding exclusion perimeters due to hydrocarbon surface contamination and active hazard zones, transformed into a logistical trap. Vessels unable to refuel or offload were forced into extended idling positions, consuming onboard reserves and approaching operational noncompliance. Several tanker captains issued open-loop distress requests for food and technical resupply, triggering inspection demands from international observers. These inspections revealed inconsistencies in documentation, undeclared cargo volumes, and outdated maintenance logs, further justifying their exclusion from insured operations. Simultaneously, commercial brokers rescinded all outstanding charter agreements for Russia-linked petroleum deliveries due to unacceptable exposure risk. These cascading cancellations triggered a collapse in available shipping slots, leaving dozens of cargoes without transport linkage and halting payment cycles between upstream extractors and downstream buyers. The trading floor response was immediate and severe. Crude futures originating from Russian benchmark grades were suspended from several major exchanges, with price volatility leading to mass liquidation of open contracts. Clearing houses invoked emergency mechanisms, freezing margin accounts and denying confirmation of delivery instruments. Middlemen positioned between Russian exporters and overseas refiners lost operational standing, triggering an information freeze and halting reconciliation between physical delivery and paper markets. Consequently, shipment verification data, typically used for settlement and customs processing, became unavailable. Multiple jurisdictions initiated legal review procedures for cargoes in transit, while major oil-consuming economies initiated emergency stock release assessments. Onshore, the refinery matrix feeding into the pipeline terminal system entered involuntary throttling. With loading operations suspended, inland refineries faced accumulation backflow in their buffer tanks, producing shutdowns across multiple production chains. Internal redistribution infrastructure, designed for moderate rerouting to domestic consumption centers, failed to absorb the shock. Fuel surpluses exceeded absorption thresholds, and cascading storage overflow triggered pre-shutdown protocols. This effect cascaded into rail and road fuel delivery systems, creating disjointed excess in regions distant from consumption hubs. Logistical operators reported uncoordinated delivery cancellations and non-return of fuel wagons, fracturing the downstream commercial balance. The financial structure supporting Russia's oil trade, already under multi-layered restrictions, fractured under the simultaneous loss of credibility, liquidity, and physical access. Secondary financial operators, often small-scale clearing houses and third-tier brokers, declared technical insolvency due to frozen payments and cargo seizures. Correspondent banking lines servicing the energy sector were suspended across several corridors, isolating Russian actors from their workaround financial channels. Cross-border settlement, previously routed through gray market intermediaries in Asia and the Middle East, collapsed under legal pressure and risk management withdrawals. Without a viable mechanism to clear or confirm sales, the oil corridor became both commercially void and diplomatically toxic. The Shadow Fleet, a complex system of loosely registered tankers operating under fragmented jurisdiction and temporary registries, lost all operability. With international insurers withdrawing, regional regulators imposing bans, and logistical nodes rendered inaccessible, vessels became static liabilities. Satellite imagery confirmed dozens of tankers idling beyond territorial waters, stripped of cargo authorization, flag recognition, and navigational clearance. Port entry requests were uniformly rejected, and offshore bunkering became legally indefensible. The system, previously maintained by ambiguity, mobility, and insurance arbitration, collapsed under regulatory coherence and precision targeting. The decisive phase thus marked not merely a tactical success in disabling export infrastructure, but a strategic disintegration of the structural ecosystem enabling hydrocarbon monetization. Russia's oil export corridor ceased to be a corridor, it became a trap of stranded tonnage, expired insurance, frozen contracts, and uncontrollable surplus. No immediate recovery trajectory was visible within current diplomatic and logistical frameworks. As the maritime corridor transitioned from active disruption to prolonged inoperability, the affected zones entered a stabilized phase of strategic denial. This stage was characterized not by additional kinetic events but by the persistence of structural damage, regulatory lockdowns, and the physical inability to reconstitute system throughput. Each terminal, anchorage zone, and feeder line evolved into a localized zone of functional collapse, where operations remained suspended not due to active threats but because fundamental components of continuity had been eroded beyond immediate recovery. In Primorsk, emergency repair crews failed to access critical junctions due to residual heat signatures, persistent low-temperature combustion, and hazardous material exposure within the pumping infrastructure. Engineering battalions dispatched to stabilize flow control systems encountered structural misalignment and subsurface warping within the foundation supports. No restoration timeline could be confirmed, as terminal command systems remained offline and structural scans indicated microfractures across multiple containment domes. Fuel residues within key pipe segments rendered manual intervention non-viable without full system drainage and environmental clearance, a process projected to exceed standard repair thresholds. Simultaneously, berth allocation software remained corrupted due to earlier electromagnetic surges, disabling the terminal's ability to receive or dispatch coordinated tanker movements. At Ust-Luga, operational lockdown extended across all sectors. The rail terminal remained sealed, with multiple lines immobilized due to axle deformation, fire-contaminated ballast, and failure of signal coordination. Fuel tankers positioned on sidings continued to idle under armed guard without any timeline for unloading or redirection. Firefighting operations, initially intended as suppression efforts, transitioned into containment protocols, focusing on preventing vapor spread and contamination of adjacent logistical compounds. The storage reservoir cluster, previously functioning as a redundancy module, remained under partial evacuation. Internal pipeline routing was deemed unfit for restart due to pressure imbalances and sensor failure. Restarting the terminal would require full hardware replacement, structural re-engineering, and external inspection validation, processes infeasible under the current maritime risk profile and commercial embargo regime. In Novorossiysk, the shutdown assumed a quasi-military format. The port area was reclassified under restricted operational status, and entry was permitted only for designated engineering and environmental response units. Off-site storage units were sealed following overpressure risks, while offshore mooring systems remained unrecoverable due to cumulative anchor damage, submerged debris, and fuel discharge zones extending across multiple nautical miles. No naval escort was available to guarantee tanker safety within the harbor radius, and minesweeping units failed to clear debris fields for operational access. Port operation software was wiped as a result of prolonged exposure to heat and voltage instability, and all synchronization protocols between inland pump stations and seaborne dispatch units were declared invalid. Attempts to reactivate command centers were unsuccessful due to system memory loss and lack of encryption keys for secure routing. The regional administrative apparatus responsible for coordinating recovery and rerouting remained unable to initiate alternatives. Arctic and Far Eastern terminals, nominally within Russia's redundancy architecture, lacked the capacity, storage proximity, and immediate connectivity to absorb displaced cargo. Inland refineries and pipeline systems were likewise incapable of functioning in bypass mode without violating pressure constraints or exceeding storage tolerances. No credible plan was submitted to redistribute crude volumes or redirect tanker rotations. Internal briefings emphasized containment, not recovery, underscoring the shift from tactical stabilization to indefinite stasis. Recovery operations ceased being characterized as temporary suspension and entered terminology associated with indefinite unavailability. International observers classified the corridor as persistently inoperable. Maritime data aggregators withdrew recognition of port schedules for all three hubs, while transshipment index maps marked the affected regions as non-participatory. The corridor's logistical metadata was expunged from real-time coordination platforms, including vessel tracking, customs alert networks, and insurance risk charts. Tankers previously en route to Russian ports diverted to alternate providers or returned empty to origin points. Domestic procurement platforms received no external confirmations for resumed delivery windows. Regional power utilities also registered secondary strain due to the cessation of heavy load operations previously linked to terminal support systems. No official declaration of corridor abandonment was issued. However, the operational indicators, from frozen schedules to cancelled charters to prolonged terminal silence, converged into an uncontested reality. The corridor no longer functioned as a viable conduit for hydrocarbon export. Its constituent parts remained present, but without command coherence, logistical activation, or market interface. The system existed only as infrastructure in name. The sustained damage and system-wide disintegration transformed a temporary tactical success into a prolonged structural denial of one of the Federation's final high-volume currency inflows. The immobilization of Russia's dual maritime energy corridors, extending from the Primorsk and Ust-Luga installations in the north to the Novorossiysk complex in the south, produced a convergence of operational, financial, and geopolitical consequences. The simultaneous degradation of all three export nodes initiated a de facto suspension of seaborne hydrocarbon monetization, not as a result of a single decisive blow, but due to the cumulative effect of structural targeting, logistic entrapment, and institutional disengagement. The collapse of throughput across the corridor has eliminated a primary conduit for foreign currency generation, severed the physical interface between production zones and maritime commerce, and dissolved the shadow infrastructure that had sustained exports under circumvention regimes. From a tactical standpoint, the inability to dispatch crude and refined petroleum through maritime channels has induced cascading friction within the internal energy apparatus. Inland refineries and pipeline hubs, optimized for synchronized dispatch into maritime loading systems, have entered intermittent shutdown due to overload in buffer zones and lack of external offload pathways. Regions previously structured around the processing and dispatch of export volumes have reported contraction in rail availability, pump station functionality, and storage bandwidth. Auxiliary systems responsible for environmental containment, customs documentation, and maritime inspection have become obsolete in the absence of operational cargo flow. As a result, the corridor exists as a non-functional industrial corridor, stripped of market integration, legal validation, and infrastructural coherence. On the financial axis, the long-term revenue loss transcends isolated export cycles. The corridor had functioned as a backbone for non-transparent financial transfers, quasi-legal trade offsets, and insurance-based monetization of off-market deliveries. With the immobilization of the shadow fleet, the suspension of coverage, and the legal nullification of delivery certificates, these mechanisms no longer serve as active instruments of liquidity generation. Correspondent banks in multiple jurisdictions have ceased settlement activities related to Russia-linked energy contracts. This has triggered cross-default clauses across a network of bilateral trade agreements, rendering previously shielded transactions inoperative. Asset managers, brokers, and third-party clearing houses tied to this structure now operate in dissolution mode. Attempts to shift volume through alternate vectors, including pipeline reconfiguration and inland redirection, face structural constraints and logistical incompatibilities that render them ineffective at scale. The collapse of the corridor has initiated strategic shifts in regional maritime dynamics. Shipping lanes previously calibrated to route around exclusion zones are being redrawn. Maritime intelligence services have revised their operational risk matrices to classify Russian ports as non-serviceable. Insurers have extended high-risk classifications across adjacent zones, impacting neutral traffic and reinforcing commercial quarantine conditions. The geographic isolation of the Russian maritime economy has widened, transforming exclusion into standard operating context. The temporary withdrawal of vessels has evolved into a permanent reorientation of international shipping behavior, with secondary effects on transshipment hubs, bunkering markets, and fleet allocation algorithms. From a geopolitical perspective, the degradation of Russia's seaborne export infrastructure represents the erosion of its last fully convertible revenue stream independent of overland arbitration or state-to-state negotiation. While overland energy delivery remains technically viable, its dependency on foreign jurisdiction, regulatory cooperation, and physical security eliminates the autonomy previously exercised via maritime dispatch. The inability to independently export via sea undermines fiscal projection, weakens reserve replenishment strategies, and depletes stabilization buffers. It shifts negotiation leverage in multilateral agreements and exposes the energy apparatus to conditionalities previously offset by maritime liquidity. The symbolic dimension of this collapse lies in the contrast between the corridor's design and its current state. Constructed to operate under duress, redundantly segmented, and engineered for throughput autonomy, the corridor was neutralized without a protracted campaign or irreversible destruction. It was rendered non-functional by a combination of strategic pressure, market isolation, insurance logic, and persistent tactical denial. The architecture remains, but the system is inert. In geopolitical terms, the corridor no longer represents leverage, it represents vulnerability. It is no longer a pipeline to power, it is a monument to exposure. This transformation alters both internal calculations and external perceptions. For the Russian Federation, the corridor's collapse reduces flexibility in energy diplomacy, limits cash flow velocity, and necessitates internal fiscal triage. For external actors, it validates the model of sustained infrastructural targeting paired with financial denial. It confirms that in the context of asymmetric confrontation, industrial incapacitation does not require absolute destruction. It requires sustained functional disruption synchronized with legal and logistical severance. As of the current phase, the Russia-linked maritime energy corridor is inoperative across all functional domains. Its recovery would require not only physical reconstruction but a reintegration into global legal, financial, and logistical frameworks, none of which are available under present conditions. The corridor is not paused. It is terminated. The system that once enabled high-volume, low-visibility revenue extraction is now locked, fragmented, and exposed. The strategic landscape has adjusted accordingly.